My views of Trump have not changed. How I speak and how I think about people who have voted for him have changed a lot, because I think it's the tendency of conflict is for so many people to see the other side as this monolith. And so we end up seeing the entire other side as boiling down to the worst people on that side. That was a snippet from a talk I had a few weeks ago with Richard Davies for his show, How Do We Fix It? That series is focused on the work and actions of Braver Angels, the nation's largest cross-partisan, volunteer-led movement to bridge the partisan divide. You can learn more about Richard's show at howdowefixit.me. This will be a reshare of that talk that I had with Richard. One of Richard's main questions to me is, why did I write a book aimed at liberals about the importance of working to reduce toxic polarization and contempt? In the view of many Democrat-leaning and anti-Trump Americans, the problem is simply Trump and Republicans. The idea that there might be things for them to work on to reduce toxicity and political discord can be upsetting and angering. But as I argue in my books, anyone who wants to reduce toxic us versus them ways of engaging should be curious about how we got to this highly polarized moment in time and not be content to settle for simplistic, it's all their fault narratives. They must be brave enough to examine polarizing behaviors and tendencies on, quote, their side of the conflict, even if they think the, quote, other side is worse. I also talk about my own personal journey from someone who used to regularly post insulting, contemptuous posts about Trump voters on social media to someone who now sees reducing toxic polarization as the most important endeavor of all, not just for America, but for the world. If you dislike highly antagonistic, highly us versus them ways of engaging, you must see that contempt is what puts the wind in the sails of highly polarized and polarizing people, like Trump. And I talk about how one can do that work on depolarization even while pursuing one's own political goals, and how taking such approaches actually helps and not hinders one's activism. If you like this talk, or if you're skeptical and want to learn more, please check out my Substack on polarization, which you can find at diffusingamericananger.substack.com. I have more than 1,300 subscribers on there. One of my most popular pieces in the last few months was a piece titled 8 Tips for Activists Who Want to Reduce Polarization. And you can read some positive reviews my books have gotten on my site american-anger.com. One review I was proud of came from Dan F. Stone, polarization researcher and author of the book Undo Hate. Dan wrote, "Elwood is one of the wisest voices on the topic of toxic polarization. His writing is clear, thoughtful, and well-researched. America needs its citizens to listen to Zach," end quote. Okay, here's my talk with Richard Davies for his show, How Do We Fix It?
We're talking again about political polarization, which I think is a bigger crisis than global warming, rapid changes in AI, or exploding levels of public debt. Now, why would I say that? Because we have to come together to solve our problems, and polarization prevents this from happening. You might have seen a recent poll that says more than 60% of Americans, around 2/3, now think the country is so politically divided we can't solve the nation's problems. This compares with half the population who thought that 5 years ago. Americans know our crisis of division is getting worse. We're going to discuss that with Zachary Elwood.
My views of Trump have not changed. How I speak and how I think about people who have voted for him have changed a lot, because I think it's the tendency of conflict is for so many people to see the other side as this monolith. And so we end up seeing the entire other side as boiling down to the worst people on that side.
Our show is about fixes.
Yeah, how to make the world a better place.
How do we fix it?
How do we fix it?
Hi, I'm Richard Davies, back again, and the author I'm about to speak with said this, and I quote, We don't just disagree on issues, we increasingly view our political adversaries as immoral, deluded, and dangerous. Our fear and contempt affect our stances on issues, making us more hardened in our views and less willing to compromise. I'm Richard Davies, and the author I'm about to speak with said that. He's Zachary Elwood, who has written 2 books on toxic polarization. The first was Diffusing American Anger. We're about to discuss his latest, How Contempt Destroys Democracy. Now, this book is not written for all Americans, but instead for liberals and progressives, people who, for the most part, loathe our president. Did political liberals and progressives play a role in ensuring Donald Trump's election? We discuss this provocative thought and more, including misperceptions about what conservatives really believe and why it is so hard to criticize our own side. Here's our conversation. Zachary Elwood, welcome to How Do We Fix It?
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
So my first and most obvious question, why write this book for liberals, for the left, and not for everyone?
It's definitely a case of, I think everyone needs to hear these messages, but I also think we need to put these ideas into persuasive arguments for specific audiences. So me being on the more liberal anti-Trump side, I thought I was better suited to write for that audience.
I think some liberals may be surprised that you're targeting this book at them,
Right.
because they think, so many of my friends who are liberals think that people who support Trump are ignorant or stupid, and that they're not the problem. It's the other side.
Right. And I think that's part of the argument I'm making, is that I think we have to think about how we might be contributing to increasing toxicity, even if we think the, quote, other side is bad. The nature of conflict is that people on both sides will always or generally think the other side is much worse, and that becomes an excuse to not examine our behavior. So yeah, my book was definitely an appeal to try to get liberal anti-Trump people to see how they might be contributing and think about those things. Yeah.
So do you think that liberal anti-Trump people are contributing to the problem of polarization?
I do, yes. And I would also point to liberal and progressive people who have made those arguments, including writing entire books about that topic. And I do like to emphasize, I think, because a lot of people will hear that and think, oh, you're saying both sides are the same. But I think it's very important for this work for reducing toxicity to point out that you can think the other side is worse while also acknowledging we're in a self-reinforcing cycle where both sides do contribute and help build each other's narratives of.
And you have an interesting backstory, because you used to be part of the problem, right?
Yeah, I pre-2020, I was quite, you could say, polarized. I spent a good amount of time online on social media, lashing out and venting my anger and disgust at Trump, making, insulting moral judgments about people that had, voted for him, and kind of like lumping in the entire other side as this overall bad or ignorant or stupid or whatever group. And I think that's kind of the fundamental driver of polarization, of toxic conflict, is so many people thinking about and issuing statements about the other side as if they're this monolithic mass of bad people, which just ramps up the divides more.
So many liberals and progressives think that it's obvious that Trump's motives are malicious and authoritarian. What are they missing? Maybe not about Trump, but about Trump's supporters.
Yeah, I think it's very important to separate leaders from the people that vote for them. My views of Trump have not changed. How I speak and how I think about people who have voted for him have changed a lot, because I think it's the tendency of conflict is for so many people to see the other side as this monolith. And so we end up seeing the entire other side as boiling down to the worst people on that side. And you can see examples of this all the time, where always so many people are picking out like the worst and most rude and most antisocial behaviors on the other side and applying it to the entire other side. You can see this with the horrible comments about Charlie Kirk's murder, for example, that this tells us everything about liberals, or you can see it on the liberal side for various things about the right. If you're someone who, like me, thinks Trump is very bad, it's very important to see that he is his election, his support comes from decades of increasing hostility, partisan hostility on both sides. Toxic conflict, by its nature, creates more support for us versus them divisive approaches.
One of the strongest points you make is that contempt for the other side is like a feedback loop. They say nasty things about us, we say mean things about them, and the vicious cycle just gets worse and worse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of people who study conflict talk about the self-reinforcing cycles, including even in interpersonal dynamics of how, we often bring out the worst in other people by they do something bad. Our reaction to it confirms to them that we are the malicious, aggressive ones. They have a lower opinion of us. They speak in more toxic ways. But if you can start seeing how many people do contribute to the toxicity and help drive it, I think that's an important first step for winding it back.
One thing I've learned recently, and your book certainly reinforced this, is that by focusing so much outrage on Trump by liberals, that's actually strengthened him. It's helped him with his supporters, because the more angry one side is at their opponent, the more that the people who voted for Trump go, well, we better rally around our guy.
Right. The ways that we can approach conflict can help build support for our, quote, enemies. And I've written a good amount about this on my Substack also, about the interesting ways in which how we respond to things can actually help create and strengthen the very things we dislike. And I think that's a very important thing to see about toxic conflict. Yeah.
Okay, so how do our distorted views of the other side ramp up our divides, make things worse?
When you see the other side as uniformly bad, when you see their motivations, their goals on so many different topics as uniformly bad or even evil, it becomes very hard to compromise, because there's multiple pressures internally and externally, group pressures of, even if you wanted to compromise, you have to contend with the very angry people on your side who do not want to compromise and are very angry at you ever compromising. So just to say, there's this buildup of incentives where there becomes more and more pressures to take more us versus them and team-based approaches, because there's inner and outer pressures. And even if somebody wanted to take better approaches, they're at the whims of the group dynamics. If they took approaches the group didn't like, they'll lose power, right? So we tend to think of the leaders and the media as having all this power, but you have to also factor in there's this group dynamic of they're getting affected by all the people around them too, right? It's not a simple case of certain people have power and other people don't. It's this group dynamic. Yeah.
There's a lot of data that's been produced, many polls, a lot of research about how polarized we are. One finding that you cite, which is just shocking, is that 72% of Republicans think Democrats are immoral, and not very different. 63% of Democrats say the same thing about Republicans. That, in other words, and this
might be higher now.
Yeah, it may be. This was a Pew Research poll taken several years ago.
I think the really interesting thing is seeing how those kinds of surveys have grown. That dislike, that hostility, the very negative, pessimistic views of the, quote, other side, seeing how that has ramped up over the past 20 years. I think noticing or thinking about how we got there and seeing how it's a long building problem is part of seeing our divides, our toxicity from kind of a bird's eye, big picture view, because I think so many of us are in the moment about the things that are outraging us. to unwind this, I think more of us need to start taking a step back and being like, how did we get here? And how did those, if you can start understanding the factors that led us here, then you're in a better position to speak in different ways, even as you pursue your goals and these kinds of things.
Well, that invites a question. How did we get here?
Yeah, well, that's a big that's a big one. I don't pretend to know all the factors, but
Well, it hasn't just happened. It hasn't
Right.
just happened because
No.
of Trump.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's also, speaking of ways, I mean, there's all sorts of ways that so many of us contribute to our divides. But I think when we act as if Trump, our divide started with Trump, there's plenty of evidence and data showing that partisan hostility was increasing over the years. I think people that are on the liberal side, the anti-Trump side, if they're genuinely curious about that, I think they do have to look at the point of view that our polarization, our divides did mean that many conservatives felt belittled and mocked and not understood at all by liberal mainstream media. And liberal mainstream media and entertainment and news and including academia, all these cultural institutions, the way that conservative associated views were treated in those places made them feel very mocked, very belittled. And it's understandable. I mean, you can read Erica Edelson's book Beyond Contempt, and she's a progressive liberal person, and she talks about this problem.
Well, but liberals would counter that by saying, look, who has all the power?
Right.
It's Republicans. They control the main branches of government. They control the House and the Senate, the White House. But you point out that when it comes to cultural power, TV networks, many mainstream media outlets, they tend to lean left. And so culturally, universities as well, many large corporations that had DEI initiatives, liberals still have plenty of cultural power.
To me, it's a big idea that I don't see many people talk about too often, that groups in conflict will always have different traits. So one way to see this is you can imagine the way that the rage and frustration of a mostly blue collar group will play out much differently than the rage and frustrations of a more highly educated and higher socioeconomic class. And that's just to say, we often try to compare the groups as if they're equal, and we use that to score points. Like, liberals will say, there's no Democrat equivalent of Trump, and they'll use that to score points and say, oh, clearly the whole problem is Trump and Republicans, and Republicans are doing similar things. They'll pick out things that are true of Democrats that are not true of Republicans and say, oh, this shows us that this is all their fault. But I think it is important to recognize the cultural power of liberal associated ideas dominating, huge swaths of entertainment media, of news media, of academia, of even the corporate settings. That can make conservative people feel very much under threat, especially when you get into the cancel culture thing that was, very prevalent a few years ago. But I think, it's important to see that regardless of the political power, the cultural power plays a big role. And I think the argument can be made that liberals had much more power in the ways that really mattered in everyday life to a lot of people. And it's a factor that might explain why Republicans were more okay with an aggressive figure like Trump.
A couple of years ago, here on How Do We Fix It, we did a podcast with Kate Carney of More in Common, which is an organization that researches polarization and looks at how to build a more united, resilient society, not only in America, but overseas. More in Common found that both liberals and conservatives have major misconceptions about the other side. Do you have a few examples of that? Where are liberals wrong about conservatives?
Yeah, More in Common is great. They did research on what they called perception gaps, and they have a great site. Both sides just generally see the other side as holding much more extreme views than they do. One major one to dig into is, the amount of racism that liberals perceive on the right. And there's one of the perception gaps was about immigration, where liberals thought that a large percentage of Republicans would disagree with the statement immigration can be a valuable asset to society, something like this. But it was a large percentage of Republicans did agree that well done immigration can be a good thing, right? Like, but to liberals, that was something that they would perceive as hardly any Republicans saying these kinds of gaps.
This is How Do We Fix It? I'm Richard Davies, and we're hearing from Zachary Elwood, the author of How Contempt Destroys Democracy. He has a website that's well worth visiting. It's American-Anger.com. We have a link to it on our podcast show page. The vast majority of Americans know we're polarized, and they believe that these divisions are destructive. Why is it that this crisis is ignored by both sides and often by the media?
Right. No, that is a very interesting thing. So often you'll see articles and op-eds about polarization. It's not really talking about the things you and I have talked about. It's mainly about just talking about our divides generally, or it's talking about the other side as being the root of the polarization of the divides. When you start to understand how conflict works and why it's so hard to get over, why it's so hard to resolve, I think it makes sense that it's so little talked about, because in order to talk about the things you and I have talked about how there can be contributions to the self-reinforcing conflict, in order to talk about that, I think at a mature and helpful level, it requires self-examination, group examination of your own side. It's just very hard to talk about that because you end up getting scared that your allies are going to attack you. So I think it's a fundamental thing about conflict that makes it hard to resolve, because the conflict makes it hard to even talk about resolving the conflict. I mean, that's why I got into this work, is because I looked around and why aren't more people in the mainstream media, journalists, pundits, politicians, why aren't they talking about these things that polarization and conflict researchers have talked about and know about conflict, right? So I just saw my role as helping to share some of these ideas that I think more people should talk about, but it's just so hard to talk about. As you probably know, it's so easy to get, pushback from people and even internally to not want to think about these things.
Yeah, most of my friends are liberals, and it's hard at say, having dinner with somebody or just chatting with somebody to go, yeah, but there is a reason why people on the other side think that way.
Yeah,
that's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, I've lost a good amount of friends, and I've been at some uncomfortable dinner parties with, liberal friends and acquaintances where, you don't really, it can be very hard to have these conversations.
They think you're the skunk in the room.
Yeah. But, and similarly that, that dynamic is happening on the right too, where, there's less room for having, less and less room for having nuanced conversations.
You're not asking us to be more moderate, are you?
No, I think that is a common misunderstanding, which I think gets in the way of this work, because my stance is that you have to separate the dimensions of what we believe. You have to separate that from how we engage with other people, right? And so you could view it as moderate in this. I'm advocating for maybe moderacy in how you engage with other people, but not in your beliefs. And that's a very important distinction.
Most of our recent episodes on How Do We Fix It have been about the work of Braver Angels, which is a nationwide campaign that brings together liberals and conservatives in the same room. And
I've been to some of those,
organizes debates and has branches across the country. Why is the work of Braver Angels and other groups in this depolarization space important?
I think there's several ways it's important. One is just getting a sense of what people on the quote other side actually believe, which I think so often is we have distorted ideas about. And then, there's various things that Braver Angels does that I think are helpful exercises. And I actually talked to the co-founder of Braver Angels, Bill Doherty, who's a couples therapist, and we talked about some of the processes, the exercises they do in Braver Angels. One of them involves what they call the fishbowl exercise, which is having one political side listen to the other political group criticize themselves about what they are not doing so well, and that actually humanizes both sides to each other. And there's actually a very interesting study about how that works, because a lot of people's instinct in conflict is to not criticize their own side, but actually criticizing your own side actually makes your group more human and more, you actually lower the toxicity and the pushback on the other side by having more nuance and pushback on your own side, which is completely counterintuitive to how a lot of people think of conflict, I think. So yeah, there's many things that Braver Angels and these groups do that I think are very helpful for seeing the path out of these toxic dynamics. So.
One of the leading lights in Braver Angels is Monica Guzman, who wrote a book. I think it's called I Never Thought of It That Way. And there's some wonderful tips in that book and from Monica about how to listen to and understand your relatives, people who you're very fond of, who may have completely different political views than you have.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Monica is a liberal Democrat voter, and her parents were Hispanic, pro-Trump voters. So that, yeah, she had some interesting stories in there about, I think that would be relevant for good learnings for a liberal audience who are interested in depolarization.
I think you've hinted at this, but I think that if more liberals and especially more Democratic Party leaders examined their own role in toxic polarization, it could make them stronger, not weaker.
Right. And I do think that is such a getting back to some of these fundamental instincts that we have that just lead us to ramp up toxic conflict more. I do think there is this instinct that people have, and so often I hear it, people in the depolarization space hear it, that they think, oh, embracing these ideas will make us weaker, they'll make us lose more. But I think that's just a completely wrong instinct on these areas. I think thinking about these things helps you understand who you're talking to more. You don't have distorted views of them. You're more able to talk to them. You're more able to persuade them. You're more able to even reach compromises that might make more people happy.
And do you agree with the statement that toxic polarization is really the number one political crisis in America, that it's holding up progress on so many things?
Yeah, I'm probably an outlier, but I think it's the number one human problem, because I think this problem has been with us forever, our inability to deal with toxic conflict. And unless we're able to get some pockets of understanding about how we approach this problem, it's just such a dangerous problem, especially as, we're going to have increasingly dangerous weapons that are capable of wiping out more and more people, so that it only takes like a small fight of some sort to be increasingly dangerous. For one example, you might have somebody making a disease in their lab in a few years, right? So the more toxic conflict we have in the world, I think these things like AI and global warming, I think, pale in comparison to these threats about toxic conflict combined with more and more advanced weaponry of whatever sort.
Talk a little bit about your personal journey. You've clearly moved towards a view that toxic polarization is a real crisis, and that was not something that you felt, say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, or even since 2019, I was insulting Trump supporters online. So, yeah, a pretty quick journey for me, maybe.
What turned you around?
I mean, it was a combination of things. I think I started thinking about how people perceived my words. Like, I drove away some friends, on social media. I lost some friends by my behavior, and I started thinking these are common ways conflicts progress and what they bring out in people.
Can you think of a specific example of where somebody who was a friend is no longer a friend? What was it that you said?
One of the things I said on Facebook, and this is, I think a lot of people do this, they're just venting, right? It doesn't necessarily reflect what they believe, but one of the things I said was, after Trump got elected in 2016, I said something like, I hope his, Air Force One crashes or something like that, I would say, that's probably one of the worst things. That might be the worst thing I said, but I was often like venting like this in a very childish way, looking back. So a friend of the family, a pretty good friend who had once let me, stay in their house for several weeks when I was in between moving to Portland, Oregon. He saw that and he was like, "Oh, why don't you go to Canada? You guys disgust me." I lost that friendship.
What else can we personally do to try and bring us back from the edge here, the cliff edge?
I mean, I think one of the only things we can do is think about our own personal behavior, because there's little else we can control in this. We're just individuals, most of us without much power. But I do think we have more power than we often think. I think our instincts often in these situations is to think that we don't have power and that the power is somewhere out there, by these politicians or with this media conglomerates. But I do think it's important to see that how we treat each other, the ways that leaders speak, the approaches that media companies take, those are all they're driven by the buildup of all these interactions that all of us have every day, right? Like we form the culture every day by how the millions of us treat each other and what we tolerate.
Let me end this podcast the way Ezra Klein ends his podcasts when he asks guests to recommend 3 books they think will be worth reading. So, what do you think people should look at to perhaps change their mind or influence their behavior on this?
Well, it'd be a bit maybe too self-promotional to mention
your
my
book.
Yeah.
It would be, but
that's
I would recommend
that's
that.
why
Yes.
I wrote it. I was like, I think I wanted it to be the one-stop shop for especially liberal audiences who are concerned about these things or even skeptical of them. I'll give a few of my favorites. I think Taylor Dotson's book, The Divide, is very good, and that's one of the better books on American polarization. And it talks about arrogance, especially in the views on both. You can hear these narratives on both sides about how we are the correct ones, and science and evidence shows this, and they are the deluded ones. And there's just this arrogance that gets promoted and getting back to that self-reinforcing cycle. And both sides have different ways of framing that. But I thought that it was a very good examination of that aspect. I'm a big fan of Robert Talese's book, Sustaining Democracy. It was so good that it was actually trying to accomplish a lot of the things I was trying to do with my book. And if I had read his book earlier, I might have just not written my book. So I wanted to throw that in there as a nod to him. He has some very good, and he's at Vanderbilt. He's like a teacher of political philosophy, something like that. But some very good arguments in there for people who are skeptical about some of the things I've said in this podcast.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Zachary Elwood.
Thanks, Richard. A real honor to be invited.
And that's our show. Zachary Elwood's most recent book is How Contempt Destroys Democracy. His website is American-Anger.com. I'm Richard Davies, host of How Do We Fix It, the podcast with a question mark at the end of the title. Our producer is the most excellent Miranda Schaefer. As always, thanks for listening.
That was a talk with Richard Davies, which was a reshare of an episode that I took from his series, How Do We Fix It? I'm Zach Elwood, author of Diffusing American Anger and How Contempt Destroys Democracy. If you enjoyed this talk, or even if you're skeptical about some of the ideas in it, I'd ask that you check out my work. Toxic political polarization is a hugely important and dangerous problem, and I think you should want to learn about different ways of looking at the problem. Because, let's face it, the existing ways of thinking about and combating the problem just aren't working. And as I explain in my books, the typical ways of approaching these problems are more instinctual approaches just don't work. And I also talk about why the standard approaches tend to add more fuel to the polarization fires. Okay, thanks for listening. Music by Small Skies.